but rather from a lack of infrastructure and proper equipment. For example, police officers not having enough cars to get around to places, even when they're trying to get home. And what we want for the day's debate from our end of the debate and from both sides actually is how they're going to showcase and prove to us how which side is going to be more effective and which side is going to be the better one. Now, also look at what the civilians will actually be doing this work was actually, or they're the debate what civilians actually think. The average civilians have their own priorities and live separate lives. Each they have their own careers, their families, their own dreams, their own hopes, aspirations, and their own friend groups. Meaning that they already have their own things going on outside of these issues. Now, we also look at what civic duty looks like. Civic duty can't replace their main job and only a part-time thing, e.g., jury duty. That's something like that as a supplement, meaning can now take up the majority of the time. And the way people view civic duty anyway is a separate additional thing that they have to do and it's not something to take pride in. Apparently not going to be as effective or well done anyway, but I'll get more into that into my argumentation. Now, the main measure for today's debate is which side provides better policing as well as which side is principally justified, and we agree with that in terms of what the first speaker said from side proposition. But what does our counter policy look like? What does our world look like in terms of trying to improve upon this? Well, we want to increase funding for police departments in order for them to have better facilities and more equipment, for example, cars, so they can actually do stuff more efficiently and more effectively in terms of getting places and going to all those other places, and also getting better training, improve the decision making as well as other facets of what it takes to be a police officer. So we also get the state. So you improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the current police force. Now, moving on to my argumentation. Before that, are there any POIs? If none, first off, people have a right to autonomy. People have freedom of choice because it works maximize their livelihoods by letting them pursue how they want to live, e.g., whether they drink alcohol or whether they want to go to grad school, graduate school, stuff like that. The government works to ensure the right and has to in order to serve their people. We understand that there may be times when people have responsibilities and have to do stuff to help the government. For example, taxes, which are used to fix infrastructure or sometimes with conscription of going to war. But we find the difference between this type of work and the compulsory work that they're trying to put upon us is because of what is at stake. Realistically, these jobs will not be very influential and thus it's not to their survival. In the comparison for the example that they themselves brought in terms of taxes and conscription, you have to understand that when there's an issue of going to war, you have to understand that these individuals have national security issues. At the end of the day, the community rights as a whole end up being in great violation. It's either those individuals or the whole country as a whole being lost or being damaged as a result. I mean that what's at stake is much greater than the individual right for autonomy. But what's being provided, being whether it's just cleaning services, as they said previously, does not necessarily have the same amount of weight because it's not inherently because having a small speck of dust on the floor won't be life-threatening or life-damaging in terms of what these other communities look through. Now, to understand that. This is an example, as I mentioned before, with tax and conscription denied, it ends up being illegitimate on the end of the debate. But we are better off as a result because we still use the same taxes that they're already inherently providing, meaning that they're already giving assistance to the government already to effect all these departments, and we still maintain the rights by redirecting these funds towards the and as a result, we are better off as you also maintain this individual. But I'll take your point now.
What about the fact that individuals get to see firsthand what the police force is like and then vote on better foreign policy?
I reach out to you, even if they don't get to see these, as you said before, they only work with systems that can handle because of a lack of time and experience and work. Being on your end of the debate from the ball, you very much actually showcase they still don't get to see systems, they still don't get to see how the police work effectively on a major scale because they're working with things that are insignificant and only small scale things on their end of the debate. Meaning that what you're saying in your POI is simply untrue because they will not get to interact with the frameworks anyway. Now, in terms of how is the effective police force overall, because the system is temporary, realistically, these guys will get less training. Because of this, they're less effective due to them not being equipped to handle these jobs. If they're less impactful jobs, e.g., paperwork, then this work is work that can already be handled by those who are present, and because they understand these systems better, they do it more efficiently and more effectively anyway. I mean that the extra systems that they're trying to provide you is not going to be that beneficial overall. If they do get more impactful positions, for example, investigating crimes and stuff like that, which can end up happening due to them either the nature of being a police being unpredictable and getting more situations, dangerous situations, still being a likely possibility as well, then it becomes problematic due to their lack of experience, due to them lacking field training or actual time spent there. Meaning that because they lack experience because they lack that, they won't have proper decision making and end up getting themselves hurt, or worse yet, getting people hurt at the same time. My second layer of analysis on this point, and rotating people, it means that they'd have to deal with this issue of people of training, which can take up more time and which can take more than a year, in fact, and experience, since they get new recruits every year from their end of the debate. I mean, they still have to deal with this issue of trying to train these people over and over again, which ends up becoming repetitive, which ends up becoming a major issue, because it means that they're getting individuals who aren't as effective. Thirdly, by having civilians who see crime, you see the civic police affairs will be less efficient, because when you do entrust them with other tasks that are important or are vital to you, then it ends up becoming problematic because of the fact that they will not do them properly. Well, on the comparative, we do it better, because we still have those officers who are still in place, but by giving them better facilities, by giving them better equipment, they're able to do things that they were doing before, but to a much better and to a much farther extent. And as a result, on the comparative, we create a more beneficial, more effective police force overall. Well, they, best case scenario, maintain the efficacy of it, which means they still lose, and worst case scenario, as I showcase, they make a less effective police force overall. Meaning that overall, in this debate, I already showcased to you why I'm there, and they're principally unjustified, or we're principally justified by maintaining the principles of autonomy, but also we showcased to you how the efficacy of the police force is in fact better overall, which is why I have never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for what was a fine speech, and I would now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for side government. Yes, we can hear you.
To give power to the people means to have to give something that is so vital that ensures the protection of our civilians and communities in the long run. That's what we provide you as a proposition. On opposition, we don't think that you get the ideal what they're talking about that they were proposing. Instead, what you're most likely to get is a police system with better guns, better policing systems, better cars, but no service delivery to the people who need it most. We think that we'd much rather shift the obligation of the very same policing system to people who actually care and to people who would do a much better job. We think that rotational systems are far better in doing so. Two things that I'm going to be doing in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to refute what was given us from the opposition, but secondly, I'm going to show you why we think that better community engagement is most likely going to lead to the de-villainizing of police systems, and why that's likely to bring us better police systems. But now, before we get into that, let's get into a few things that they told us about our case. We got 3 responses to our case as a overall. Firstly, how we can have prejudice, so we're not likely to really solve the issue of police brutality and all of those things. Secondly, how you need an experience to fulfill the job of a police officer and being within a police department. And thirdly, how you're not likely to solve the problem of brutality and all of those things. 3 responses to those 3 ideas. Firstly, we think that they have a misconception of what our problem analysis is here. We think that our issue is the fact that policing departments aren't being fulfilled, and its role isn't being fulfilled by the people who are already in power. This is mainly because of how they don't understand how communities work and how these communities need to be protected. Once we put individuals who already understand the severity of certain issues within our community, we think that we're most likely going to have a much better policing system, but we're most likely going to have more people having to do more jobs and having to do better jobs than the current system, because of how we have individuals participating in that very same policing department. But moreover, we have people who actually want to do that. Secondly, we're training these individuals for a certain number of time. So what this means is that within the period that they are in, we think that we're most likely going to cover the basics that they need to know and that they need to fulfill their jobs for. That's enough for us to have a better police system, an effective police system, because people know what they're doing, and we think that the training that they have is likely to come from an experience factor that already them enough resources to make sure that they are capable of doing their job. But thirdly, we think that the way in which these communities view you is far more important than having to just fulfill any kind of job. So the idea of prejudice and all of those things is still likely going to be much harsher on our side because you come from that community. We don't think that you're most likely going to get away with things like police brutality because these are people who know you and these are people who grew up with you. Once you do something that's bad to them, we think that the backlash towards you is something that's so dire that you need to fulfill your obligation in order to just not have those problems occur to you. So we think that on our side, we have the much bigger obligation to mitigate those issues to begin with. Now let's get into what they told us directly. They told us two things. Firstly, how people have the right to autonomy and how this job isn't really vital because they're not doing something that's important. But secondly, how you need experience in order to make sure that you do a much better job. Firstly, let's deal with the vital point. So they tell us that it's not really vital because you're not going to be doing something that's very important. Why is this not true? We think that most of the goals of the community, most of the goals of the communities have an obligation to protect you because of the lack of policing in this case. So any involvement that you have is vital towards having to protect your community. And the jobs that we're talking about here isn't just cleaning the bathrooms within these policing departments, isn't just doing the basic jobs. It's having to deal hand in hand with policing departments on how they're going to be dealing with cases. It's having to build up strategic plannings on how you're going to be dealing with crimes. We think that those things are vital in order to make sure that your community are protected in the long run, but moreover that you as a person is most likely going to have the very same future and have the ability to do the jobs that they were talking about on opposition, not taking. The second thing that they give us then is this idea of experience. Two responses. Firstly, we think that the same policy that they're talking about is the same policy that has been harming individuals for far too long. We think that we've had a lot of police with army equipment, but not doing much towards protecting individuals, but much rather having to harm the very same individuals. That's because they don't come from those communities and they don't have a direct obligation towards protecting them in the way in which we want them to, because they're just doing their job, but moreover, they're not doing their job in the way in which we want them to. But secondly, we think that these are lives of people. So it's a huge obligation for you to take on that kind of job, regardless of experience. We think that once you're trained to do this, we think that you're able to do that job because of how you come from a background that has given you the opportunity and the resources for you to fulfill that job. What I've done with this rebuttal is show you why, firstly, we have an obligation morally to make sure that we can protect our communities, but secondly, why we think their case is still the same status quo that has been harming us for too long, and the same status quo that we want to change. Opposition, do better. Now let's get into our argumentation of why we think that better community is something that leads to the de-villainizing of policing systems. How does this happen? Firstly, it restores trust within these policing systems. One, we think that with a rotational system comes with the constant checks and power by your fellow community members. What does this look like? Firstly, because the burden is one that is of huge sensitivity and of limited time, we think that people within your community want to see the progress that you're making, and we think that that would put people in a place where they continuously need to do their job. Because you come from that community and have that very huge obligation that we highlighted in our first speech, we think that once you are able to track the progress of how members are acting, we think that you're most likely going to be checking the power that they're using and how they're using it. Before the second point, I'll take a clear one.
That in status quo, there's already a system in place that allows civilians to report situations. Why then is it necessary to have the entire country on government's payroll instead of having these complaints just well?
Could you please repeat that? I can't hear you.
Granted that there's already a system in status quo that allows civilians to place complaints and critiques, why then is it more effective to have the entire country on government's payroll instead of a system that addresses these complaints well?
Cool. The problem is that once we lay out these complaints, they're delayed for 2 to 5 years. We think that we want practical engagements with the policing system, and we think that a rotational system is the best way in doing so. We think the checks and power that happen within the policing system and how they're going to be dealing with these problems is the most practical way of having to deal with those issues to begin with. Secondly, we think that we involve people in how policing works by giving them the power to do so. Once we do so, we think that it restores the kind of trust that we have in the policing system, because as community members, we feel empowered to make sure that we protect our individuals. On our side, we think that you have that obligation existing, but moreover, you have that benefit of having individuals protecting themselves, but moreover, working hand in hand with the very same police department that protects them. Secondly, we think that on our side, you have better public discourse. How is this the case? One, because everyone is on that board with the traditional system, we think that we broaden the amount of discourse on how to further the policing system. We make the policing system much more transparent, for example. For example, as we were talking about, like how you're discussing how strategies would be working. Why do we think that these things are things that de-villainize the policing department, and why are they important? Firstly, we think that communities trust people in policing systems who can relate to them more. Means then is that you're most likely going to relate to a person who comes from your background much rather than a chief who just comes from some other area that you don't know. We think we want to restore trust within policing systems in order for us to have a much more progressive one, and one that could protect individuals in the long run. We think we do that better. Stand with proposition.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a fine speech, and now I'd like to call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for side opposition. Yes, I can hear you.
So if you have any points of information, reach 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, side propositions argument can only be described as one word: overkill. When side proposition proposes to us a solution to some problems that exist within status quo, and that solution involves the mobilization of the entirety of the country to try and fix some problems, we think that there is a problem at hand. We think that when there are so many different solutions that could be used to fix the problems that they do state, and they do not actually advocate for those solutions, they lose this debate. But also at a point in time where their policy is not actually going to fix the problems that they state, and is likely going to even make them far worse than they are in status quo, we think that they fail their burden as proposition. So what do we get from side proposition in this debate? Firstly, side proposition gives us this idea on police brutality, and how something needs to be done about police brutality. And they tell us something about how, if a person who's in your own community is the one who's your own policeman, then that police brutality is somehow solved. Two things on this. Firstly, we tell you that police brutality doesn't magically disappear. Why? Because even in their own mechanism, they tell us that these policing systems still exist, which means that the actual police officers that we've been talking about this in this whole debate were being said to, want to, or who are being said to be actually carrying on brutality against the own country still exist. So that doesn't necessarily make police brutality go away and just start rotating people within the system. But also on that, the fact that you are making this a compulsory and a mandatory rotational system means that any Tom, Dick, and Harry who is within the country is going to have to be involved within the country's policing system at a certain point in time. This is problematic at a point in time where you consider the fact that the people who are going to be committing crimes within your own state are going to be those civilians you're talking about. So at a point in time where the people who are likely, because people don't inherently become good people, or don't inherently stop becoming racist simply because they come from the community and simply because they aren't policemen. At a point in time where those people come into the police office without training, because the training that they're going to get is likely going to be far mitigated as a result of the fact that people are constantly being rotated out as compared to citizen policemen. They have no experience, and they're not more corruptible than police officers are, and they're likely to be as bad people as police officers are. We think that you should not fix the problem, but the brutality that you're going to get in your world is going to be far, far worse than the kind of brutality that we get in status quo. At least in status quo, we can actually hold police officers to account. At least in status quo, the problem by investigating the system to be fixed be giving more transparency and showing people things that are going wrong in your civilian investigation into policing systems. The problem is not fixed at a point in time where you just replace someone else, and that person is also as bad as the police officer, or likely to be as bad as the police officer, given that we are all humans, we're all not infallible. So we have a problem. Proposition proposes that. But then we also get this argument from proposition we talk about the social contract justifies government mandate. We tell you that the social contract doesn't justify forcing people to drop their livelihoods for the sake of government, especially for a service that government is mandated to provide to by at a point in time where people are paying taxes and people have expectation of government to expect government to provide them with protection from crime. At a point in time where government asks people to actually do these things for themselves, when people are already paying for those things, we think that the government violates its contracts with the, and we think of autonomy is far more desirable in this sort of a world, right? But I'll get into that in my substantive matter. The inside proposition also tells us about how police officers don't necessarily understand the problems of their own communities. But we tell you that police officers still come from the police officers are very understand these problems because they come from the communities. They aren't necessarily taken out of the loop. But even if we're to buy the idea and we're to say that police officers somehow suddenly stop going on around them, we tell you that at a point in time where everyone is going to be a police officer, at some point in time, people stop telling each other what is going to happen within status quo. What is happening around, and people are less likely to understand what is happening within their own communities because everyone becomes skeptical of one another. I'll take your point.
Would you support medical professionals prior to do community service upon completion of their degree?
I do not understand what is out, but I would argue that there is relating medical professionals might be service and actual police officers who are required to act in the protection of, and I honestly don't get where that point of information is coming from, so I will not answer that. But anyway, moving on to our case, moving on to my substantive matter. So on my first point of substantive, right, we talk about the principle of autonomy on side opposition. But on this principle, we tell you that people have the right to be autonomous. That is to say that people have the right to not be forced by government to drop their livelihoods, aspirations, and goals for the sake of government goals. In as much as people they have some responsibility to government, that does not reach into mandating a career for them and taking away their ability to self-actualize. Now, we think that this is not ethical at a point in time where people are also paying money in taxes with the expectation that government is going to serve and protect them. When government forces people to provide their own security and their own protection, when government was supposed to be doing that in the first place, government violates the contract that is between it and its people. It is not ethical for government to force people to get into public sectors that they pay its government to run simply because government has failed within those sectors. Rather, we think that it is far better for us to actually try to investigate these systems, what's wrong with the police system. Open up the police system to investigation by civilians. Make the police department more transparent. We think that what we shouldn't be doing is resorting to overkill measures that require the mobilization of every single person within the country in order to just investigate a specific department within the country. We shouldn't be taking away people's own rights at a point in time where there are other more viable solutions that can be used to try to fix the problem. But also we tell you about how the quality of policing is so important within our communities, right? Police officers are the people that are assigned to the job of protecting people. That is to say, places that don't have good quality, well, that means that places that don't have good quality of policing are more likely to have are more typically, rife with crime because, good policing or bad policing equals more crime. So what needs to happen is that at a point in time where quality of policing is going to drop because the people who are being involved in the actual policing do not have as well of training as we would want them to have, and are not as well trained and do not have as much experience. We think that the government, at a point in time where they mandate these people to protect our communities, they are failing their mandate to keep people safe within the environments that they exist in. At a point in time where proposition provides us this unimplementable plan that is more likely to cause harms than good, harm than good, and eventually it is going to infringe on people's own fundamental rights that are important to them. And at a point in time where the solution is overkill and where there's so many other solutions that are implementable that do not result in worsening the situation in terms of brutality, where they offer that solution, that opposition loses this debate proposition, and we're proud to win.
Okay, I'd like to thank that speaker for a fine speech, and I would now like to invite the government whip to conclude the substantive case for side government.
And I prefer my POIs to be in the chat, so please don't unmute yourself during my speech unless I've accepted your POI. Yeah, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think the fundamental problem within today's debate and within the police force is the same. It is this us versus them mentality, a separation between police and the communities that they are supposed to protect. At the point at which you have a police force that views themselves above their fellow citizens, above the people that they serve, as a separate entity, similar to the military, similar to the government, we think we have a problem. We think this is what causes two abuses in power. This is what causes police to view themselves as indestructible, members of society that view themselves as above the law. This is the problem with the police force. This is what side proposition claims our overkill measures seek to better, right? I have two main clashes within today's debate. Firstly, how we get a better police force, and secondly, whether or not this conscription is something that is legitimate, right? Under my first clash about who gets the better police force, few things here. Firstly, on community policing being more effective. Firstly, we told you here that community policing is always something that's going to be better at the point at which you are able to integrate the police force, which primary goal is to protect the community. It's so that community members are able to protect themselves. We think at the point at which you have average people, every Tom, Dick, and Harry entering this police force, we think you are able to have a better one because you are able to exercise more empathy when you grew up next door to a person that you are now meant to protect. We think you are more likely to be understanding of these people's plights when you grew up in the same shoes as them. This is something that side proposition themselves conceded to in their first speech. We think why it's better on our side is because we get people who averagely wouldn't join, people who criticize the police for their abuses of power to join and change things structurally from within. Secondly, we think on this point on mitigating crime and how you make people skeptical of their own community members, of people who they've been friends with for their whole lives. We think the skepticism is valuable. The skepticism of people around you is what allows us as the side to be so effective because we're able to mitigate crime. We're able to see what community members are more likely to do things wrong, what causes in the community, whether it's a lack of education, whether it's a lot of gangs within your area. You're able to understand the causes of crime and deal with them effectively in a way that you wouldn't be able to if you weren't well acquainted with the place that you lived, right? Third point on this point on increasing funding. Not only is this not a fair policy for side proposition to take, if you have more money, we have more money. This is symmetrical on both sides. We can get all of those benefits on our own. We think that the police themselves already have a surplus of funds. Police forces are oftentimes the main benefactors of tax money. We don't think that throwing money at a police force is what's going to make it better. We think at worst, throwing money at the problem just makes it worse because now you have police forces who have military grade equipment and are shooting grenades and gas and tear gas bombs into protests. We think that is what happens when you throw money at the problem. That is side proposition's solution to an already failing institution, right? Lastly, under here, we think that police themselves need more people within them, and we think that is what's actually going to cause structural change within them, not just throwing money at the problem. Fourth thing we need to talk about here is this point on conscription not being effective and how you aren't able to engage meaningfully within your community. We think not only is this strategically like a weird line for side proposition to take, not only do they accuse us of like taking away people's abilities to self-actualize because now they're forced into the police force, but we're at the same time told that they can't engage meaningfully. You need to pick one. You can't have both within the debate. But we think that all engagement within this is meaningful. We think at the point at which you have a person serving in the police for even 2 years, something that isn't that much time out of your life in the grand scheme of things, we think that in and of itself is something that's valuable. Lastly, we think that merely even if like you aren't able to engage meaningfully, we still think that representation in this instance matters. It matters to be able to have Black police officers, to not feel like afraid to not feel afraid as a young woman when you see a male police officer, to have female police officers, to see people within your community becoming police officers. We think that is something that is valuable, even if you aren't able to create a structural change within the police force. So lastly here, we need to talk about this hoarding of power within the police force and this us versus them mentality that it creates, right? We think that this is something that needs to be like broken up. We think it's seen in situations where people like police officers quite literally kill innocent members of their communities, Black people within their communities, and merely get like suspended with pay and don't get any like meaningful investigation done. We think there's a mindset within the police to protect their own and to like put themselves above the law. And we think that this gets broken up when you introduce like the wider community into this place, when you have a rotation of people within power, when you don't have the same people being the police chief for 7 years and like cultivating relationships with the people in his force and only his force and not engaging with the wider community. We think we're able to break up these issues and have people who want to go in and protect their own, represent their communities. We're able to do that on our side. A benefit that is exclusive to our side, something side proposition just wants to give more money into, funnel more money into, to make it more exclusive, to make them more dangerous. We don't value that. We think what we get on our side is representation of all kinds of communities within the police force. We get better protection and we get a breaking up of like systemic issues within the police force on our side, something side opposition simply can't claim within today's debate. But before I move into my second clash, I can take a PI from the opposite bench.
Thank you. So my main PY to you is, how can people who have not interacted with police work before on a significant level benefit policing in any way?
We think those people can simply be trained. Those people can learn how to engage with the police. We think having fresh faces and having younger people go into the police force is something that we value. We value these people's like quote unquote naivety when it comes to the police, because we think that is what's going to create change within the police force. And we think those people aren't always going to be like fumbling and not know what they're doing. Those people can be trained. Those people can be taught what to do. You don't go into every profession knowing exactly how to do that profession. It works the same way with military conscription. It works the same way with like medical professionals. You go into the job and you learn how to do that job. For centuries, we sent basically civilians off into war, and that's never been an issue because we recognize those people have a job to do. They have a responsibility to their government, right? This leads perfectly into my second clash on whether or not it is legitimate to conscript people. Here, we talked at length about the social contract created between government and people and the obligation that community members have to not only their government to serve their government in return for like things like basic rights, but also to their communities, to protect them, to represent them. They give us the opposition that tax is enough form of like the social contract. We simply don't think that this like tracks, because tax isn't direct enough. Your tax money goes everywhere. And we think not everyone pays taxes, not all communities pay taxes. Taxes simply aren't a way to create meaningful change within the police force, meaningful change within society. And we think that this is a right that we're willing to revoke certain levels of autonomy away for, because you have an obligation to your state, you have an obligation to your community. We're the only side that values this obligation and values the protection of communities. We're the only side that can win today's debate.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a fine speech, and I would now like to invite the opposition whip to conclude the substantive case for side opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Pronouns are she, her. I'll be taking my POIs verbally, but I will indicate when I'm taking POIs. So please do not badger. I will not take you. Okay. Granted that I am still audible, I will be starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, the issue that we see with prop case is that they give us wonderful pragmatic benefits to a case and a policy that they have not presented, right? They give us an excessive solution to an issue that is not existing and an issue that is not on. Right? So we tell you, panel, that what we get from side proposition is a situation whereby a policy basically stands for us having civilians stepping into the police force. They tell us in first speech that their policy is not going to have these civilians in the front line, right? But they proceed to give us so many benefits that only happen when these civilians are within the front line. 2 responses to this. We tell you, 1, if you say that these civilians are not in the front line, so many of your pragmatic benefits fall short and do not stand. Second of all, we're going to say that even if you were to say that, fine, we change our policy, now these civilians are within the front line, we tell you that put them in so much danger, right? You put them in the danger of being in positions that only belong to people that have been trained and are well aware of what needs to happen. So what are you going to get from my speech? You're going to get the major clashes that we get on both sides of the house, right? You're going to get major rebuttals that we get on the case that side proposition has given us at what it is and at its best, right? So first thing that we have, first of all, they say that the main problem and the fundamental issue that we have within status quo is the idea of an us versus them mentality, right? So 3 responses to this. First of all, it is not solved by putting an entire nation on your payroll, right? At the point in which you simply put an entire nation on your payroll and assume that solves the issue, that solves the division between police officers and civilians, we say that is untrue, right? Second of all, they give us this idea of how this money on this, if on both sides of the house you have money, they have a payroll, we have a payroll, fair and fine, right? But we tell you that more money is being diverted into paying these civilians. Let's just take their case at its best, though. Let's just say that they're not paying these civilians. These civilians are doing a public service. And let's ignore the fact that being a police officer is a profession in and of itself that needs people to be paid with, right? Fine. We say that they're not paying these police officers, they're not paying these civilians, right? They're simply trained. We tell you that the time that it takes to train these civilians, right, is time that we simply do not have, right? They give us this argument that, yes, we're simply going to train the people and we're going to let them participate we're going to train the people, and that's going to be the best solution that we have, right? We tell you that the time that it takes to train people, the time that it takes to train different individuals on a constant level, right? To train different individuals constantly that are coming in and out of rotation. It's too much time and it's too much work that we're saying that is not worth it if we look at the bigger picture and if we look at the problem that is trying to be tackled. What is the problem in status quo? The problem in status quo, as both sides have conceded, right, is the state of the police force. We tell you that at the point in which side opposition offers you a world where these policemen are trained better, are given better facilities, and are given a better ability to then address issues that they're given on the field, we tell you that that is the world that we support, not simply a world that tries to integrate civilians into the police force. Now, second thing that we get from them, they give us this idea of community officers being the best people, right? They give us this issue of how as soon as you have a community member within the police force, you're going to have a much better police force. 3 levels of response to this. First of all, we say you are unlikely to have a situation where these people are willing to then tell what's going on within their community. We say that a secretary is very unlikely to make any change within this community, right? A janitor is very unlikely to be able to actually say something within these police officers, right? That was going to make a change. We tell you that these people are very unlikely to actually tell what's going on within their communities. We look at areas that are rich in crime, areas that are rich in gang violence and the like, where the main role and the only policy that is there is do not snitch, right? We tell you that civilians are very unlikely to then snitch in this case. Therefore, their pragmatic benefit is not seen. Fine, let's say people are willing to, let's say that these people are no longer secretaries, and let's say that these people are willing to then report. We tell you that there is still a system in place that allows you to, in status quo, that allows you to then report what's going on within your community, right? Now, why the system is better? One, you have a situation of secrecy, right? You have a situation whereby no one is aware of who exactly is the one that told. Whereas in side proposition's case, you have everyone being aware of the fact that Timothy is the one that is currently within the police force. Therefore, Timothy is the one that snitched on us, right? And they can now directly go towards this man instead of towards this man because they're well aware of where this man lives, right? This puts him in far more danger than we do on our side of the house. Whereas on the house, a trained professional, right, who's well aware of how of how to address this situation. He's the one that addresses the situation and addresses the crime that is within this area, right? And not even mention the fact that they assume that somebody is automatically going to be an amazing person as soon as they step into this police force, right? We tell you that it's still very much possible to have the leader of a drug cartel being the one that is on rotation at that moment and at that point in time. So the they have on this being community officers being better is a point that we're not willing to let stand on this in this debate, right? But before I move on to my next rebuttal, I'll take a point.
Your alternative is to give an AK-47 from military bases to the same prejudiced police officer that you say is the problem. Make it make sense as to how you're going to be protecting communities even further.
That's not our solution. One. Two, what our solution is giving training and better facilities. At the point in which you don't get services simply because a police officer or police station does not have a car to get to your location, we tell you that we need to provide those cars. We tell you that one, we give training so that people respond to issues better. Fine, fair, fine. We say we don't give training on our side of the house. We take your case at its best. Your solution is then to give a simple gun to a civilian who has no idea what's going on. Either way, your side of the house still loses on this clash. Moving on to my next rebuttal. The idea of better voting. They give us this idea that once somebody is within a police system, they understand how the police system works and therefore are more equipped to vote. 3 levels of analysis to this. First of all, again, we say if we were to run with their policy where people come in and civilians come in and take moderate roles, it does not hold true, right? Second of all, we say you do vote which police officers are put into play, right? That's not something that civilians go into a voting box and vote for. They vote for people in power, right? They don't necessarily vote for whether or not Officer Timothy is going to be the one within the office in their area, right? Okay, fine. And let me tell you that you're only seeing, what people are then seeing in this situation, even if they were capable of voting which police officer stepped into power, right? We tell you what people are seeing in this case is they're seeing civilians at work. If we're saying that civilians are the ones that are going to be taking on the major challenges, we're telling you that they're seeing civilians at work. They're not necessarily seeing the power or the ability of that specific police force, right? If voting and finally, the final level of analysis, if what you're aiming to do is vote people, police officers in, or vote police officers in order to get better policing, we tell you that better policing is achieved on our side of the house. And we don't have the middleman of at least like a 5-year period, right, where people are waiting to vote again, of just poor policing and poor responses to issues, right? Finally, trusting in the policing system, the final response that we get. So first, we tell you that the police officers on the ground are not necessarily people from that community, right? We tell you that because you're simply stating that people are going to be trained, if we're dealing with a drug syndicate, if we're dealing with those type of situations, the person that's going to address these issues is not going to be Sarah from next door who was just recently hired into the police force, right? Second thing that we tell you is that a drug dealer does not necessarily care whether or not you had dinner with them when you were children. A drug dealer is still going to shoot them regardless of whether or not you are quote unquote community. Therefore, that practical benefit once again falls short. We tell you that government is not in a position to force people that are already paying taxes and contributing in other ways into sectors that they're supposed to be managing themselves. With this, I've never been prouder to oppose a motion.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a fine speech, and now to call upon the opposition reply speaker to conclude the case for opposition. Yes, we can hear you.
In 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, I've personally quite enjoyed this debate because side proposition present us with not only a contradictory case, but a strategically flawed case that I believe is going to be their very own downfall. Not even the very case that we as side opposition have lied to. But I'd like to point out the various issues today. First off, I'd like to deal with this issue of their constant straw manning and mischaracterization of what our policy looks like, which we explained to you. We explained to you what a country policy looks like in terms of it being funding, in terms of getting better facilities and infrastructure to better train these individuals and help them get around much faster. Saying that they're going to get more guns is simply a gross mischaracterization and misses the whole point of what we're trying to advocate for, which is why we believe that their comparatives end up falling flat for most of the debate. But also, another question I'd like to ask is, what's the exact position of these civilians? Because the first speaker stated that these civilians will not be put in harm's way and work as secretaries and have more menial jobs within the police force in order for them to fulfill the civic duty but remain safe. But then secondly, the second and third speaker also went on to contradict that and end up focusing and pointing out that these individuals will actually have a say on how these investigations will have a say and also be part of what these in fact matters do happen, meaning that on the end of the debate they still put these individuals in harm's way, which is why on which I'll move to my glasses to explain why this is more problematic, but just to showcase to you that their case is inherently contradictory. But in both cases, in both scenarios, they still lose out on this debate, no matter which poison our poor panelist has to choose out. Now, look at the principal clash. First off, the issue of autonomy and the social contract. You have to understand that yes, the government does have an obligation to protect its people, meaning that by putting in people who are inherently not as well trained and not as experienced in these dangerous situations, means that they're not going to, in fact, be well equipped enough to be put in these harm's way. And as their first speaker stated, these individuals will not be put in this harm's way. As a second and third speaker say, they will put in harm's way, meaning that they end up getting harmed, which means the government fails its mandate. But secondly, if they put these individuals in terms of like trying to put them into menial jobs which don't have much of an impact by taking away this time and using mandatory conscription, because I already showcased to you earlier why this isn't vital or necessity or how it's going to have a major significant impact on the way the police in fact function, it means that they still violate their rights for a menial gain at best. Meanwhile, there in the debate, looking at the two positions that they tried to place in the first and second and third speaker speeches, they still lose on the principal clash point, meaning no matter what, they still lose on that principal clash. But let's look at the other major issue in this debate, being the pragmatic point. When the pragmatic points of who in fact has better policing. And I'm going to tell you, panelists, we win this clash point out by a country mile. So looking at the two main metrics, I'm going to use magnitude. First off, understand that by the way, we have better trained people with more experience, because they showcase to you these individuals becoming by choice and will also have more time and experience to in fact be part of these fields, meaning they'll be able to deal with these issues on a better scale. But also the very benefit they're trying to also showcase to you, being a community benefit of being part of the community, ends up becoming their weakness because of that tight-knit community and because of that tight-knit bond in their best case scenario. These individuals will not want to report to each other and will not want to get their friends who they say they all know each other in the trouble because of the fact that they already know each other and already have some sort of bond, which makes it less likely to in fact actually report this actually is less systemic change as they actually think. I mean, on the other debate, there's in fact less change. Well, in the comparative, when we fund them better and give them better facilities, work more efficiently, we also work out these issues on a better scale and make them more effective and more efficient as a result. Meaning they really make what they do good even better, meaning that we improve police and do it even better than they do. Well, also, thirdly, my final point is the issue of their training. The very training they forsake and the very training that they want, their training forsake, that they believe is problem status quo, is the very training they want to give people. Meaning that no matter what they're trying to give to you, panelists, what they're saying is inherently contradictory and does not make any sense on the debate. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have to understand is that this debate is clear cut. In both scenarios, and in both, I've analyzed you in both scenarios where we either go with menial jobs or we go with, in fact, maximize actual proper impact. They still lose out principally because they violate other parts of social contracts. But secondly, in terms of actually achieving pragmatic change, even if they try to showcase and try to flip this into a utilitarian argument for some reason, they still don't get that main benefit that they're trying to get out. Neither at the end of the day, they don't have a better police force, not principally justified, and at the end of the day have achieved and not achieved either of the goals. And because we've achieved what they want to do even better than they have, we win this debate. And as a result, I have never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a fine speech. And finally, I'd like to call upon the proposition reply speaker to conclude the case for proposition and the debate as a whole.
Cool. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, cool. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to tell everyone this for free, and I so wish that a police department would actually listen to me when I say this. Being a police officer and working within a police department means more than having a gun, means more than having a fast car to attend to people, means more than having equipment. It needs you to acknowledge the fact that you're working for a community and the fact that you need your community's trust in order for you to do your job accurately. That's the problem that we've been trying to tackle all along. Because of how there's been a lack of policing towards the certain issues that we have, we think that it's up to the community to take that obligation and make sure that they fulfill it for themselves. That's the principle of self-defense. That's the principle of social contract amongst the people. And that's the principle of having to make sure that you have a future, a principle that opposition just lets slide. We think that we win just based off of that. But let's do a few more clash work and show you why beyond that principle, why we win this debate. 3 clashes that I'm going to be dealing with. First, let's talk about the policies and how these 2 policies have been set out. We think that on opposition, there's been a complete mischaracterization of what we meant about firstly having to be within the front lines and what our policy is trying to fix to begin with. We think firstly, not everything needs to frontline work to be effective. So you don't need to hold a gun and shoot someone for you to have an effective police force. We told you that we'd have strategic planning towards having to solve specific issues that a community would have, and that's enough for us to have an effective police system. The first thing that you need to have is having a set goal, having a set plan towards fixing it. We think that on our side, you have a much better capability of making sure that individuals are protected, because that very same strategic plan comes from community members, not just from people who come from another section of police departments. Their alternative to this was to say that we need to give police departments more money, need to give them more infrastructure and all of those things. We showed you why that isn't enough for them to win the debate, because of most of the problems that exist is within the very same police department that doesn't cater for the needs of those individuals. So they have the equipment and all of those things. It's just that they're not using them in the way in which we want to. We don't think that they're most likely going to be really winning the debate just by throwing much more money at the very same police department. So policy framework, we take the debate. Secondly, is it legitimate? We gave you 2 things. Firstly, how the policing problem has become very harmful and how we need to take action amongst ourselves. The second thing we told you is social contract theory. What we got in response to this is the idea of you're paying taxes, therefore you don't need to really work and all of those things. Why do we win this clash on a principle level? Firstly, we tell you individuals have an obligation to fulfill their own needs if they feel as if the state isn't providing for them. We told you this within our second speech and our third speech because of how we told you that taxes aren't enough to have an effective system. We told you that individuals would take up a necessary goal that they want to achieve because of how they feel as if the state is failing them. And once they do that, we think that they're principally legitimate in doing so because it's a principle that they want to uphold for themselves. But secondly, we think that they deserve that kind of power because of how policing systems haven't been working out for them. I told you specifically because of how the problem within policing systems is the lack of effectiveness. We think that people deserve the opportunity to make sure that it's effective in the long run. We win this clash, simply put, because of how we take in the obligation as individuals to make sure that we secure our own futures. But moreover, since the state has failed, we think that we're justified in having to do something that makes sure that we succeed. The second clash then is which side is much more effective. We told you 3 things. Firstly, how you're most likely to get a much more de-villainized police force. Secondly, how given the obligation, you're most likely going to deal with things with much more urgency. But lastly, how you have strategic planning and all of these things. What we got in response is that give more money and we promise it'll work out. It really won't, because the very same policing system is the system that doesn't do enough for these communities. Once we have individuals who actually care about their jobs, we're most likely going to get people having much better plannings as to how to deal with problems. The truth is, not everything that the state provides for us is very much the best thing ever. As communities, we'd much rather take it upon ourselves to fix them.
I'd like to thank that speaker for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to thank all speakers for what was a very good debate. I think now the judges, we're going to move to the judging room and we'll give a result for you in about 15 minutes or so.